I always dreamed of a wedding filled with meaning, not spectacle. But when my fiancé and I chose to celebrate our love in our own way, my family refused to come. They said it wasn't proper. What they didn't expect was what happened after. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, the kind of place where people still say yes ma'am without irony, and where family names carry more weight than job titles. Our home sat at the corner of Whitaker and Gaston Street, tucked behind an iron gate and a pair of 100-year-old magnolia trees. It was a Greek Revival house, painted bone white with tall columns that made it look like it had secrets to keep. And trust me, it did. My parents, Thomas and Evelyn Harper, were old Savannah, the kind of people who spoke softly, dressed sharply, and believed that how something looked mattered almost as much as what it meant. My father was a partner at a law firm that bore his grandfather's name. He served on historic preservation boards and believed that order, both legal and social, was something sacred. My mother, she ran the local garden club with military precision. She knew who had fallen out with whom, who served what at brunch, and who had dared to wear white after Labor Day. At home, everything was curated. From the silverware we used to the books we displayed, nothing was accidental. Our dining room was always set, even when we didn't eat there. My mother believed a polished appearance was a sign of moral character. She used to say, "We don't raise children in this house, we raise Harpers," which meant no loud voices, no messy feelings, and certainly no asking questions about why we did things the way we did. I was the youngest of three. My two older brothers, Graham and William, were already married by the time I finished college. Their weddings had been events, capital E events, tuxedos, horse-drawn carriages, string quartets. Their brides were lovely, soft-spoken, and came from families just as old and polished as ours. Their photos appeared in Southern weddings and hung in frames at the top of our stairwell. Everyone assumed I'd follow the same path. Same type of man, same kind of wedding, same life of country club brunches and silent expectations. But something inside me always felt misaligned. It's hard to explain. I wasn't rebellious exactly. I went to the same finishing schools, wore the same dresses, smiled the same trained smile at the same kinds of parties, but I felt like I was playing a character, one I hadn't auditioned for. I wanted more than formality. I wanted meaning. I wanted conversation that made my heart race, not because of anxiety, but because it mattered. I wanted love that wasn't about what people would say, but about what we could feel when no one was watching. But in my family, feeling was dangerous. It made you unpredictable, and unpredictability was just another word for embarrassment. So I smiled. I nodded. I played the part. Until the day I met someone who made me wonder what life might look like if I stopped pretending. I met Daniel on a Saturday morning in late spring. The azaleas were in bloom and Savannah was already warming into that slow golden heat that makes everything feel like it's moving through honey. I'd volunteered to help organize a community garden in a low-income neighborhood, something my mother called quaint and my father didn't even acknowledge. But to me it felt like one of the only places I could breathe. Daniel was already there when I arrived, wearing old jeans, boots caked in mud, and a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hands were in the soil, planting sweet potatoes like he'd done it 100 times. When I asked if he needed help, he smiled without hesitation and said, "Only if you're not afraid to get your hands dirty." It was the first time in years I'd heard a man speak to me without calculation, without posture, just presence. We worked side by side that day, mostly in silence. It wasn't awkward, it was peaceful, like neither of us felt the need to perform. Later, he offered to walk me to my car. We talked about food. He told me his mother taught him to cook, and he believed meals should be shared, not shown off. I told him I grew up in a house where dinner was formal and quiet. He laughed softly and said, "Then I'll have to invite you over. My place is the exact opposite." I did go, and everything was, in fact, the opposite. His home was small, lived in, filled with handmade shelves, thrifted furniture, and mismatched mugs that didn't apologize for their chips. The walls held photos of family, friends, places he'd built with his own hands. The kitchen smelled like garlic and lemon. The music was old jazz, playing from a speaker tucked behind a stack of books. We talked until midnight, about books, about places we wanted to go, about what we believed love should feel like. And not once did I feel like I had to shrink myself to be accepted. Daniel never tried to impress me. He didn't ask about my family name. He didn't care what car I drove or which boarding school I'd attended. He asked what made me feel alive. He listened, really listened. And over the weeks that followed, we kept meeting. At farmers' markets, over steaming bowls of soup in his too small kitchen. He saw the version of me I kept hidden from my family. And not only did he accept her, he made her feel seen. When he told me he loved me, he didn't do it with roses or champagne. He did it while fixing a squeaky cabinet door in my apartment, wiping his hands on a dish towel and saying, "You make this place feel like home." And when he proposed, kneeling awkwardly in the middle of a marsh trail, ring in hand, hair full of wind, I said yes. Not because it was grand, not because it was what was expected, but because for the first time in my life it felt real. For a while, everything felt peaceful. Daniel and I were planning a life, not a production. He had started sketching the plans for a small home he wanted to build for us, solar-powered, full of light, nothing fancy but filled with purpose. We spent weekends cooking together, talking about travel, maybe kids one day, but mostly about how to build something that felt ours. Then we told my family about the engagement. We invited them over for dinner, just my parents and my brothers. Daniel made his mother's lemon rosemary chicken and I baked a pie from scratch, even though baking terrified me. I set the table with care, nothing too formal, but still respectful. I wanted it to feel warm, real, a merging of two worlds. At first, they were polite, not warm, but civil. My mother complimented the pie, my father shook Daniel's hand like he was closing a business deal. They didn't say anything cruel, but I could feel it. That quiet tension, like the room was waiting for something to go wrong. And it did. When Daniel said we were planning a small, intimate ceremony on the coast, no more than 40 guests, my mother's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. 40, she said, as in 40? Yes, I replied, just close friends, people who really know us. There was a pause long enough to feel heavy. Then my father cleared his throat. Well, I assume that's before we add in business partners and family acquaintances, he said. We're not planning to invite business associates, I said carefully. My mother blinked. Sweetheart, weddings aren't just personal. They're about community, reputation. You can't exclude the people who've been part of our circle for decades. They haven't been part of my life, I said gently. My brothers exchanged glances. Daniel sat quietly beside me, calm, grounded, but I could feel his hand tense around mine. The conversation spiraled from there. They offered to book the venue, the Heritage Club, of course, my childhood church, the hotel for out-of-town guests, the string quartet, a custom gown designer from Charleston, and then they handed me a preliminary guest list, 286 names. I scanned the sheet, names I barely recognized. Some I knew only as my father's law firm clients or neighbors I hadn't spoken to since I was 12. I looked up. This isn't what we want, I said, my voice soft but firm. My mother pursed her lips. My father leaned back and folded his arms. You're making a mistake, he said. A wedding sets the tone for a marriage. You start with disrespect, you invite chaos. Disrespect? Daniel finally said, gently but clearly. With all due respect, sir, Eleanor and I aren't trying to disrespect anyone. We just want something that feels like us. My mother looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, and then she said something I'll never forget. If you insist on doing this your way, Eleanor, then I'm afraid we won't be attending. The words dropped like a stone in the room. Suddenly, everything was quiet. No clinking forks, no nervous laughter, just silence. I nodded slowly, not because I accepted it, but because I realized this was who they were, and maybe who they'd always been. They weren't angry because I was marrying Daniel. They were angry because I was choosing something they couldn't control. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The pie was still half-eaten. Daniel put a hand on my shoulder and said, I'm sorry. I turned to him and smiled through tears. Don't be, I whispered. I think this was the first time I've ever made a decision for me. The days after that dinner felt quiet, but not empty. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was stillness, like standing in the eye of a storm, aware that things were swirling around me, but finally able to breathe in the middle of it. Daniel didn't pressure me. He didn't try to fix it. He just stood beside me, steady, gentle, present. He let me feel it all, the grief, the weight of it, the strange mix of sorrow and strength that comes when you finally stop trying to please people who never learned how to love you fully. One evening, a few days later, we sat on the porch of his little house, drinking sweet tea and watching the light fade over the marsh. "I still want to get married," I said quietly. He smiled without hesitation. "So do I." And just like that, we began again, but this time entirely on our own terms. We chose Tybee Island, a place close to home, but far enough to feel like ours. Not a ballroom, not a country club, a small weathered inn that sat right on the edge of the coast. White shutters, salt air, and wild grass that danced in the wind. It was perfect. We decided on 40 guests, not because we wanted to exclude, but because we wanted to include meaningfully. Every name on our list belonged to someone who'd been there, not for our image, but for our hearts. Friends who had shown up when we were grieving, neighbors who brought soup, not gossip, Daniel's parents, warm and welcoming, who hugged me like I'd been theirs all along. Even my childhood piano teacher, who once told me, "Playing well isn't about perfection, it's about telling the truth." We hired a local planner named Maribel. She helped us find a jazz trio who played barefoot in the sand. The food came from nearby farms, shrimp and grits, rosemary cornbread, peaches soaked in bourbon. Our flowers weren't perfectly sculpted. They were loose, soft, gathered from fields and local gardens. My dress wasn't custom made in Charleston. It was off the rack from a local boutique, tailored by a seamstress who hummed while she pinned the hem. It didn't sparkle, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself. Not the Harper daughter, not someone else's legacy, just me. We didn't have a strict schedule. There were no seating charts carved in gold, just handwritten cards tied to little jars of honey. A symbol, Daniel said, of the sweetness we'd built together, simple, real, lasting. There were tears that day, mostly mine, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming peace, a knowing that I wasn't walking into a version of life someone else scripted. I was walking into our life, step by step, barefoot if needed. When the ceremony ended and the music started, Daniel pulled me into a dance I'll never forget. He whispered, "You look more like yourself than I've ever seen you," and I believed him, because for the first time, I believed me. There were 4 empty chairs, reserved for my family, just in case. They stayed empty. I didn't stare at them, but I felt them, like phantom pain. A reminder that choosing yourself often means letting go of people who only loved a version of you that they controlled. But all around us, there was joy, there was light, there was laughter and clinking glasses and soft jazz in the background and salt in our hair. We didn't just get married that day. We claimed something. Not just a relationship, but a rhythm. Not just a promise, but a freedom. And we did it without apology. The day after our wedding, I woke up early, before Daniel, before the birds, before the world. The ocean was quiet. Gentle waves tapped the shore like they were being careful not to wake anyone. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and walked barefoot to the edge of the dunes. I just stood there, watching the tide move in and out. It had been beautiful. The ceremony, the music, the people who came, everything we wanted was there. Except them. The 4 empty chairs still sat in my memory, sharp and cold. Even though I'd prepared myself, it still stung. They didn't come. Not even a card, not a call. My father had always been a man of principles, and I guess, in his mind, I had broken them beyond repair. Daniel joined me a little later. He didn't say anything, just took my hand and stood with me. I didn't need words, not that morning. Later that week, we returned home, back to his small house, back to quiet routines. I didn't hear from my family, not even when the wedding photos started making the rounds. At first, it was just friends sharing them. Then someone posted them in a local bridal group. Then Southern Living magazine reached out. They said our wedding felt like a return to sincerity, like it reminded people what weddings could be when they weren't about show. I laughed, honestly, not because it was funny, but because the very thing my parents called embarrassing was now being called inspiring. The article came out 2 weeks later. Full-page spread, photos of us laughing barefoot in the sand, Daniel twirling me under string lights, people smiling over cornbread and peach cobbler. It was gentle and kind and true. And then the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail at first. It was my mother. She said, "We saw the article. The photos were lovely. Your dress was simple, but tasteful. Perhaps we could talk soon." No apology, no admission of absence, just a carefully worded maybe. I listened to that voicemail 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. It wasn't reconciliation. It was image control. Now that the world approved, maybe they could too. Daniel watched me from across the room. He didn't say anything. He knew. Later that night, I sat on our porch again. Same spot where we decided to begin again. Same stars, same breeze. I thought about how painful it is to be true, not in theory, but in practice. Because no one tells you that standing in your truth might mean standing alone, that being honest with yourself might make others deeply uncomfortable, that love, when it's real, sometimes costs more than you thought you could pay. But then I looked at Daniel, curled up inside reading, lamplight soft on his face, and I remembered something. The cost was real, but so was the reward. I didn't trade family for a wedding. I traded expectation for freedom, performance for peace, control for connection. And that was worth every empty chair. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a slower rhythm. Not normal exactly, because something fundamental had shifted, but peaceful, grounded. I went back to work. Daniel took on a new project designing a community center just outside the city. We cooked simple dinners. We read at night. We took long walks without checking our phones. In the silence left by my family, I found something unexpected. Space. Not just physical space, but emotional room. Room to breathe, to think, to be. I still hadn't called my mother back. Her voicemail stayed saved in my phone, unplayed since that first night. I wasn't angry, not anymore. But I wasn't ready either, because I'd spent most of my life shrinking myself to fit inside her version of daughterhood. And now, I was still learning what it felt like to take up space in my own life. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table flipping through a printed copy of the Southern Living article. I paused at a photo of Daniel and me standing on the beach. The wind had caught my hair, his tie was crooked, and we were laughing, truly laughing. We didn't look perfect, we looked happy. And for the first time in years, I liked the way I looked when I was just being myself. That night, I posted one of those photos on social media. No caption, just the image. I didn't expect much, but the next morning my inbox was full. Old college friends, former neighbors, women I hadn't spoken to in years. They didn't comment on the dress or the decor. They wrote about the feeling in the photo. One message read, "You look free. I hope I find that kind of love someday." Another said, "Thank you for reminding me that simple can be sacred." And another, "I didn't know it was okay to say no to my parents. Maybe it is." Something cracked open in me reading those words, not because they praised me, but because they understood me. And then another message appeared from my sister-in-law, the wife of my oldest brother. She wrote, "I saw the article. I cried. I wish I'd had your courage. I hope one day we can talk." I didn't expect that, but it softened something. Later that evening, my father called, not a text, not an email, a call. I let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was quieter than I remembered, measured, tentative. "I saw the photos," he said. "I admit I didn't understand your decision, but you looked happy, and that matters." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. He asked if Daniel and I would come by for Sunday dinner, just the 2 of us. No ceremony, no expectations. I didn't say yes right away. I said I'd think about it, and I did. For days. Not because I was bitter, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping back into something I'd finally stepped out of. But eventually, I agreed. We went. The house hadn't changed, same rug, same smell, same silence between long pauses, but there was a softness I hadn't felt before. My mother served peach cobbler in the same dishes I'd grown up with, and this time she didn't correct the way I held my fork. No one said the word sorry. No one needed to. What we had wasn't a reunion, it was a reset. A quiet, imperfect beginning. In the weeks that followed, I kept waiting for something to break open, some big moment, some grand apology, some sign that the people who had missed my wedding, my family, had finally seen the light. It didn't come. What came instead were small things, a text from my mother that simply said, "Thinking of you." A package in the mail, a box of heirloom Christmas ornaments from my childhood, no note inside. A message from my brother Graham with a photo of his kids drawing with crayons. He wrote, "They miss their Aunt Ellie." These weren't dramatic acts. They weren't everything I once thought I needed, but they were something. Quiet offerings. Not a bridge exactly, but maybe the first stones toward one. At first, I didn't know what to do with them. I'd spent so much of my life bending toward people who didn't bend for me. I was afraid that letting them in, even a little, might undo all the growth I had fought so hard to earn. But healing, I've learned, doesn't always look like a reunion. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it's choosing what pieces to pick up and which ones to leave where they fell. So I didn't rush back. I responded, slowly, when I felt ready. A short call here, a holiday card there, and when we finally sat down for coffee, my mother and I, it was careful, cautious, but civil. She asked about Daniel. I told her about his latest project. She didn't offer an apology, but she said, "I can see that you're happy." And in her world, that was probably as close to "I'm sorry" as she knew how to say. I left that cafe with a strange sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer needed it to be. For most of my life, I'd looked at love as something I had to earn. I believed if I followed the rules, smiled politely, and stayed within the lines, then maybe, just maybe, I'd be enough. But the truth is, love that must be performed for is not love at all. It's approval. And approval is a currency that can be taken away the moment you stop spending your soul to get it. What Daniel showed me, what our wedding taught me, was that real love doesn't require perfection. It asks for honesty. It makes room for your full self. The messy parts, the loud parts, the inconvenient truths. And now, I'm learning how to give that kind of love to myself. I've stopped apologizing for the way I take up space, for the kind of life I want, for the choices that make sense to me, even when they confuse others. I still feel grief sometimes, grief for the version of family I'll probably never have, the effortless closeness I used to envy in holiday movies, the way some daughters seem to belong effortlessly in the arms of their mothers. But I also feel gratitude for the distance that taught me who I am, gratitude for the silence that gave me space to think, gratitude for the man who stood beside me, not trying to change me, not trying to fix me, just holding the door open while I found my own way through. This is what growing up looks like, not just getting older, but waking up one day and realizing you're not performing anymore, you're living, and even if it's a little quieter than you imagined. So, if you've ever felt like you were standing at the edge, between who you are and who they expect you to be, I hope you know this. You're not selfish for choosing peace. You're not broken for needing space. You're not wrong for wanting a life that fits you, not just their version of you. We're taught to believe that honoring ourselves means dishonoring others, but that's not true. You can love people and still say no. You can be kind and still choose different. You can build a life that's smaller on the outside, but infinitely richer within. If you're in a season of distance, a chapter of letting go, or the early days of starting again, I want to remind you, you're not behind, you're not too late, and you're certainly not alone. Because someone out there needs the story you're still writing, needs your courage, your softness, your truth. Thank you for sitting with me in mine. And if this story touched you in some way, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that being true to yourself is not a betrayal, it's a beginning. And if you've lived something similar, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's remind each other that even the hardest stories can lead to the most beautiful lives.